I just think one of the questions is just to notice what is at the centre of this culture. This is one of the ideas I use in my work around, it actually comes from the idea of Buddhist mandalas, which are these sort of geometric forms, and what's at the centre kind of radiates out and determines the whole world, if you like. In a way, you could say it's a bit like Eastern systems thinking. So the question of what's at the centre is actually a very good question to ask, and one could ask it of one's own life. What am I really putting at the centre? Not what I say, but if I look at how I spend my time, what's at the centre? Because that is kind of creating your world. But if you look at what's going on in the world, well, we've put a few ideas, fairly shoddy ideas. Maybe they were useful at a certain point. Maybe one or two of them were useful after the Second World War, or after the First World War, or about counting certain things and making certain numbers bigger. And you put a few numbers at the centre, and everything else kind of clusters around that. And before you know it, here you go. You've got industrial growth society. And it does what it's intended to do very well. It's just there's a whole load of concerns and questions that just get shoved to the edge. I'm fascinated by the idea of what could a future society or a more integrated society look like. And it would absolutely have that. The school system would be different. You wouldn't be having politicians and policymakers say, well, the purpose of the school system is to create a workforce. They would be saying the purpose of education is to create, integrated, healthy, wise, compassionate human beings. Well, you put that in the centre and everything would start to reconfigure.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess.
Hello folks, thanks for tuning in. It's Dan here. This is episode 34 where I'm in conversation with Tim Malnick. Now, first up, apologies for the great pause in the podcast episodes. Not the reflections from the great pause, which is this little mini series of episodes that I've released during the lockdown, but just generally the momentum has kind of has ground to a halt for the last 4 weeks. Now, mainly being because I slipped a disc in my neck 4 weeks ago, which without doubt has probably been the most painful thing I've ever experienced. A sort of surreal kind of pain and just the inability to move, basically. So that was interesting. The first couple of weeks were somewhat pharmaceutically blurry and very, very painful, but I just haven't really been able to do anything. But I'm starting to get back to movement and moving around, and keen to start getting the old episodes out again. So weirdly as well, actually, the where I tend to record and edit podcasts when I'm at home, so I have a studio in my garden, and weirdly the internet in my studio also kind of broke just about the same, just literally before the disc went in the neck. So I think maybe the universe was telling me to, just like slow down, which I've had to do, which has been a whole nother thing. I'll probably do a podcast episode on that, actually. Anyway, here I am. I hope you're well. We are in early June, and yet again, the world is sort of the unravelling continues to accelerate around us, or at least appears to be. I'm not going to speak to that at this moment because I'd like to do more on what is happening right now and everything that's been happening with Black Lives Matter, but that deserves some intentional focus, which I'm not able to do justice in this moment. I want to just get out now some of the episodes that I recorded back in May, all of which I believe are exploring themes and ideas which are connected and related to what we're witnessing right now in the world, and the oppression that we're really starting to see be revealed. As listeners who listen regularly will know that, I'm a total believer in interbeing and interconnectedness, and that all these crises we see and all the violence we see in both the human world and the non-human world are intimately interconnected. And so I think some of these themes, some of these episodes coming up will we'll touch on things which are absolutely speaking to what is going on right now. So this one, let's get to it. This one was recorded in May. Now, Tim is, he's an agent of change. He's a coach, a facilitator. He works kind of on a personal level, organisationally, and sort of seeing the sort of wider system of change. He is a Buddhist student and teacher, and in his words, he's a recovering ex-politician, local politician. He was a core faculty member at Ashridge Business School, and he was a core member of the teaching team on the Masters in Sustainability and Responsibility, which is actually where I met him 10 years ago when I did that Masters. Now, that programme was described by Harvard Business Review as sort of path-breaking and transformative, and maintained a international reputation for transforming people's thinking and doing and allowing them to act more creatively and courageously for change within their professions, organisations and paths. And for me, certainly, this was a catalyst for the change in my life in 2009 when I took part on this 2-year programme. And Tim was my tutor. He's also author of this amazing book called The Crystal Mirror, which is a collection of short stories for kids and adults, which has a kind of fairy tale-like approach to the stories, but they're very much again about the themes of sort of learning, change and development that Tim really practices throughout his work. And a lot of his stuff, and even these stories, were about this kind of the sort of nature of change and how discovery comes from letting go, and how change is very often about acknowledging who and what we already are. And basically, Tim has this kind of core belief that sort of runs through his work, is that individually and as a culture, we're waking up to this realization that our current patterns of work, organisation, business are unwittingly contributing to the ecological, social and economic crises that we're facing, and how many people in all types of different organisations struggle with this kind of balance of how to, inverted commas, make a living with their own kind of sense of values, and this kind of deep longing for work that is kind of meaningful, which is contributing to kind of a wider flourishing of culture and society and planet. One, if you can check out Tim's work, I'll reference it all in the show notes, but his work through his Different Space platform. And one of the threads that Tim's been exploring for many years is around our relationship with money. And he has been developing kind of workshops and practices and tools to help people unpick and understand their personal relationship with money, and how often we see money as the core of our problems and also the sort of barrier, if you like, to our kind of dreams. And it's fascinating work, well worth checking out, and Tim offers all kinds of workshops around this under the title of Your Money or Your Life. Right, let's cut to it. This is episode 34 of the Spaceship Earth podcast with Tim Malnick. Enjoy.
So, Tim, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Hi, Dan.
It's we're using Zencaster technology here, which is this is the first time. So you're definitely, there's a whole new experiment going on.
It looks very impressive on my screen anyway. Every time one of us talks, some purple lines come up. So
yeah, let's hope it sounds good for everyone else by the time they listen to this.
And let's hope what we talk about is interesting as well.
Yes, so, yeah. I'm sure we'll get some level of interest occurring. And so we are. Where are we? We're in May. It always takes me probably a couple of weeks to get these things out. It's the 7th of May. We're in. I don't know what week it is now of sort of this lockdown scenario. And before I guess we get into, a bit about, getting a lot about the kind of the work you're doing. And I'm always really intrigued, and my listeners are always intrigued to understand a bit more about the context, the stories of my guests, and what has the journey been to get them to do the work they're doing right now. So that's what I want to dig into. But just because we're in this sort of slightly crazy pandemic scenario, how are you feeling today? That's always a nice place to start.
You mean with the crazy pandemic? I mean,
Yeah. How are you sort of showing up right now? Always keen to know.
well, uh, I'm in this. I mean, practically, I'm relatively all right. I think I'm one of the lucky ones, right? I've got a roof over my head. I haven't lost my job. I've got food. So, one of the things I've been thinking about this situation is it's really exacerbating inequalities, right? So, personally, I'm okay. My work's still interesting. I'm appalled by our government, but nothing new there. so that's not really new. I mean, I think it's interesting how I think certain people are being found out, during the crisis. So I'm trying not to consume too much media
Mm.
because it enrages me, and I'm not sure it's helpful. So I'm actually been limiting. Apart from the first week or two of the lockdown, I've consciously had to limit my media intake, which I think is good.
Yeah, that in itself is it's an interesting discipline, isn't it? Practice, because
It
I
is.
sort of
Yeah.
I've been trying to do that and
Yeah.
failing miserably at times, and other
Yeah.
times getting into a rhythm of it and feeling really good. And
Yeah. It is. I mean, we might talk about that later because one of the
yeah,
things I do is I run online retreats, I think and so we talk a lot about boundaries and how you put boundaries into daily life to support the sort of consciousness, I guess, that you're at least aspiring to. It doesn't. It's not easy for me either, but it does make a difference. So we won't necessarily talk too much about politics. I think the other thing, in terms, how I'm showing up is, and I'm guessing maybe you're similar, and a lot of people who might have been on the podcast. I haven't felt very freaked out by this, and I think that what happens is if you've lived with, my entire adult life, and in some ways even earlier, for whatever reason, I've lived with a sense that what people called normal, modern, progressive society was just a kind of a fairly wobbly, ramshackle veneer that could and probably would collapse at almost any point. And maybe that sounds flippant to say it, but it is actually true. Maybe when I say a bit more about my story and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think that, again, people who are working in climate change or who've been following various things going on in the world, that's not to say there isn't tragedy in the pandemic, and there's all sorts of things, but I find myself more interested in how will this play out in the medium long term, and what are the possible scenarios where things that are starting to happen now turn out either more or less positively or negatively. So I'm quite interested in that. I'm not
yeah.
personally overly affected or freaked out by the actual pandemic at this point.
And so on that, because
Yeah,
you're someone that does, as I find increasingly more people that have, you have quite a lot to your work, and
yeah,
you coach, you facilitate,
yeah,
that you do that on a sort of personal level as well as a sort of organizational level. A lot of all your work is effectively around change,
yeah,
and you're a practitioner, you're a Buddhist practitioner, and you've dabbled in politics, you've written books, you're a dad, and also I met you. My original connection was
yeah,
you were a key guide and tutor to one of the most progressive sort of sustainability masters programs that this country, I think, ever produced. Right?
yeah. I remember meeting you very well. I remember our conversation. We were sitting on a bench in that courtyard. And that was Ashridge Business
That's
School.
right.
I remember it very well. Yeah,
So you've been surrounded really
yeah,
by, you've been sort of immersed in sort of life and change and how things are sort of shifting constantly.
yeah,
And can you tell us a bit about, just for those that won't know your work and
yeah.
you, and just a little bit about that journey that you've been on that sort of
Sure.
brings you to this time?
Yeah. I could go way back.
Go as far as you want.
Well, it's funny. I'll share two stories from my childhood. Partly because a whole body of psychology that I've got really interested in at the moment pays a lot of attention to kind of key childhood experiences. Often they've just got a kind of a quality or things you remember, and not in a negative way. Almost like they're often seeds, little seeds or little clues or breadcrumbs in odd things you remember about childhood. And we could talk about that loads later, right?
Let's dig in.
And so when I think about my story, just two things from when I was, I must have been about 7 or 8. It was the Queen's Jubilee. So what was that, 1976, 77? And I heard on the radio that the ex-king of Greece had presented the Queen with some amazing gold thing. I don't know what it was. And I told my mum I was going to make a present for the Queen. And I have no idea why I did this. I have no idea why this is what I did. But I made her a little story. I made a story and I illustrated it. And it was about a woodcutter whose job was to cut down all the trees. And then he decided one day he didn't want to cut trees anymore. So he stopped doing that and he started planting trees. I have no idea why I did that, but somehow I remember that story and I sent that off to the Queen. And then a year later or whatever, it was 1979, and it was Margaret Thatcher time, right? I think it was the first election she won. And again, I wasn't particularly interested in politics. And I remember, I must have been about 9. We had a pretend election at school, and again, for no reason I can possibly think of, I stood for the Ecology Party, and all I remember doing was standing up in fits of giggles, saying, "We love bunny rabbits." And that was it. So I say that because sometimes there are seeds there that make no sense, and you couldn't say where they come from. But then later on, you look back at your life and you go, "Well, that's a funny thing to have been doing." So if I give a bit more quick, up-to-date history.
I love that, though. That's got me thinking of seeds.
Yeah, well, we could talk about it, because if people listening to this, I mean, you were saying before, I think a lot of people are asking questions, right, about their lives and am I on the path I want to be, and how does my path connect with what's going on in the world, and how do I develop and individuate as a person, but also respond to what's going on in the world. So that that in a nub is my work, right?
Yeah,
basically. And you said an interesting thing. You said you work very with personal stuff and with organisation stuff, and that's true. And I even work in a way with kind of macro stuff about economics or different sectors. And the point is, in my mind, those aren't separate. So it's not like I think, sometimes I do personal work and sometimes I'm doing organizational work. If I'm working with a person, maybe someone comes to me for personal, you could call it life coaching or whatever. For me, the whole system's there, right? Their past, their ancestry, the choices they've made, what was or wasn't apparently possible for them. And also, even if you're working at their deepest personal level, everyone is part of what's going on right now. Everyone's part of a bigger thing. So for me, these two things are completely intertwined. And I think that's the key to how I work. And it is not just me. There's many approaches like that. But I think a big problem in, if you like, the model that's got us to where we are has been people believed in the separation. People actually believed there was personal and there was organizational, there was emotional and professional. So,
and so much of that, I guess, is exactly that. Is funny. I mean, it's sort of this the crisis of separation, or the story of separation, as Charles Eisenstein would call it. But it's like this sort of at this moment right now, it's sort of, again, it's in many ways, it's kind of screaming at us again, sort of in terms of how might we respond from all of this? Will we respond in a separate way again, removed from all these, or might we respond in a more integrated, joined up, interconnected way?
Well, that's the opportunity, isn't it? And let's see. And you see both. You see both at the moment. And I will carry on briefly with the story, but you do see both, because you see all sorts of creative stuff happening for the people who've got some capacity and ability to do that right now, which isn't everyone. You see stuff about community. You see all sorts of people a little bit in the bubble maybe that we're at, thinking about what's possible. But then there's a lot of very conventional stuff as well, including the language about it's a war on the virus and all of this sort of stuff. So I see all of these things going on right now. And I'm more and more interested in my work and supporting people. A lot of the time it's almost like I'm thinking, what makes the difference to support someone to live the new story as fully and courageously as they can? Because I know there's so much that pulls us back to the old story, right? There's so much that pulls us back to believing in separation or a kind of linear cause and effect model of how things work. And I'm very respectful of that. I think in my youth I was more against it, or more had more animosity to it. And now I just understand there's this dance, right? There's like, and it's in us and it's in the world. There is a new world, if you like, waiting to be born. And that could sound very grandiose, but that's as simple as each of us has something inside us that could be a very new, fresh, creative way of living our own lives. And there is something that you might say pulls us back, or appears to get in the way, or seems to sound very convincing. And I just see that dance going on everywhere. So it's in the pandemic, it's in the world, it's in you and me right now, it's in the choices we make. So that's kind of what I'm fascinated by.
Tell us more about the journey into this.
Yeah.
Because it's I love. I mean, I know some of your journey,
Yeah.
and what you must have experienced by also, to your point. But when I first met you in the master program, just the way that you work with so many people that are sort of facing into these things. I'd love to know how that all happened.
Yeah. Well, there are sort of threads. So, I had a fairly conventional middle-class North London upbringing. Loads to say about that, but in some way, nothing kind of that remarkable. I did a psychology degree at university. I had no idea what I wanted to study. I was going to study law because I was kind of into righteousness and fairness and goodness.
Yeah.
And one of my teachers said, "Oh no, don't do law. I think you might enjoy psychology and philosophy." So I looked into it. I studied psychology. I mean, I had no sense at all of what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go. I've never had a obvious career path, and in some ways I've struggled.
Did you know how you wanted to be at that point, or were you?
No idea. No, and if I did, it would have been, the product of a, doing my best, confused, whatever, 17-year-old. So no, I don't.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think if I stop and just think of it a bit, no, I'd never really had any sense of a vision for my life, either outwardly in terms of career or even inwardly. But if I look back, and I wasn't always living it then and not even now, I do think something about, what the Buddhists call basic goodness has always been with me in terms of fundamentally my worldview is that however screwed up things get, people are basically good deep down. I think that's always been just, to me, self-evident. So it doesn't mean I wasn't, angry and, a bit anti-establishment and pushing against all sorts of things, which I certainly was, and that's still with me with my activist stuff. But I think if you said any vision of how I wanted to be, it wasn't about how I wanted to be, but I think deep down I've always felt people are good. And then, of course, the question is, how do we make such a mess of things? And I think that has propelled me into my work. It's like, and it does link with my work, because fundamentally, although I work with, as you know, money and therefore some economic ideas and sustainability and some climate ideas, I'm not really an expert in any of those things. In the end, it does come down to kind of a very deep faith in human nature, and that I really, and I still believe it to this day. I think the fundamental human condition is that we are, in essence, deeply wise, deeply connected, deeply kind. And, we all manage to forget that a lot all the time, and we create messes personally and in groups and organizations. So I'm not naive, but I guess if you asked me about that would have probably been, a kind of a very vague semi-conscious sense at that time, really. I've always been very idealistic in that way.
There's I guess because that's I think, and not that I'm any kind of expert in, I guess, bringing more of our kind of whole selves and living in more presence, but you always struck me as someone that was much more aware or sort of awake to the sort of sense of beingness, if that makes sense, in the moment. Certainly, even like I remember coming into the master's programs, which maybe you could talk a little bit about how that
Yeah.
came, because I think it was such an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that you say that. I don't necessarily have that sense of myself, but then, I'm aware of my own total, capacity to be confused and to not act from presence, and and I don't think I'm talking myself down. It's possible in some ways that the more you practice, the more there is. You see your limitations. So
Maybe I was just completely frazzled when I.
You could have been frazzled. You could have been projecting onto the tutors. It could have been all of these. It could have been all. And maybe it was occasionally true for 5 minutes every day. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's nice, and people do sometimes say that about me, and it's kind of funny, But you're always working with your own edges anyway, aren't you? So I talk about the masters. So look, I did a psychology degree. I'll go through this. I'll try and go through this quickly, and then we can always revisit bits. I really didn't like psychology. It was at Oxford University, so-called best university, or one of them. I found it totally frustrating, not satisfying. I couldn't articulate it at the time why, and I was a bit bolshy and a bit, countercultural. And the two most interesting bits of it were both through sort of young PhD students who were doing kind of wacky stuff. One was doing artificial intelligence and consciousness, and one was studying actually Rupert Sheldrake's work on morphic resonance. So it was, and I just kind of thought, why is psychology so narrow? Why don't they ask the really interesting questions about who are we, and what is consciousness, and what's going on? So looking back, that was really helpful. Because I'll carry on the psychology thing, but it's realizing I'd studied at one of the supposed great universities and found the whole thing somehow didn't stand up that well. Actually, supported what I went on to do, but I did a psychology degree. I then spent a few years beginning another thread or two other threads in my life. This is post university. I had no obvious career. I was doing a lot of activism, a lot of creative stuff, performance, music, doing lots of festival stuff. And I guess I got exposed to broadly the counterculture, and this was in the early 90s. And that's when I connected with two other big strands in my life that have gone along with the psychology. One is sustainability. So I learned about green issues and the planet and Gaia, and I studied permaculture, which is like sustainable design. And that was all kind of straight out of university. So in a way, I had the learning in the 3 years after university that I would have loved at university. I was suddenly opened up to all of this stuff. I explored kind of psychedelics as one does at that time, not massively, but it was definitely informative. And I also learned to meditate. And all of those things sort of happened in a few years. And again, I wasn't really aware of it because I've never had a clear, particularly at that age, a clear kind of vision. But looking back, it was like I was asking questions. And the questions I was asking is, number one, about who are we really? And what is this really? And what's going on? And I only realized, for me, it's when I connected with kind of some Buddhist teachings and the experience of meditation. I went, wow, there are people who have been doing this for, hundreds, thousands of years, who've actually understood something about the things that, no one would even want to talk about at Oxford University. So that was for me, connected me to the idea that experience is key, that working with your actual experience, your actual awareness is key, and that there are people in the world who know how to do this. That was a total revelation. And then the other revelation at that time was, and this spoke to the kind of maybe the earlier teenage childhood thing, which was, there's something about how the world works. We were quite well off, we were all right, it all seemed to be working, but kind of in my heart and soul, I knew there's something not right about this. Something doesn't work, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And then when I connected with, sustainability and green ideas, it was like, these people have thought that they're beginning to explain why, even though it appears to work, our society and our economic industrial model doesn't work. And for whatever reason, those two things came together in my life at the same time. Something about deeply questioning, what is it to be a human being and to be alive at all, and very deep personal stuff, with the fact that, oh, and by the way, we're kind of making a mess of the world and no one's quite admitting it. And I think that all went into my work. And then in my late 20s, I decided probably I do need something that looks a bit like a career. I mean, that was true. That was quite useful. I didn't want to just hang around with some very interesting kind of countercultural folk forever. And it was more than that. I wanted to step back in. I wanted to contribute, or I often think what I do is a bit of a translator or a storyteller, that I bring stories or I bring possibilities from, as you said, kind of an edgy world or a marginal world into the mainstream. So I decided to train in organisation psychology, which was perfect because, as you know, it's like work psychology, psychology of human career, vocation, but also groups, teams, organisations. And I figured out if I do that, it will allow me to both go deep with people one-to-one and look at some of these big kind of global or macro questions. And more or less that turned out to be true. So that's the work I do. And then just to complete what you said, how we met, very early on that path, I realised that most business psychologists or work psychologists are using their skills to support the mainstream view of business and work. And that's okay. They can help people a lot, but that just was not interesting for me. I had no interest in doing leadership development to just support, more widgets or greater profit. So I've always wanted to use my skills in service of people who are either exploring, who are saying, you know what, the model doesn't work, or my model doesn't work, and I want to make a greater contribution, or I want to align my work with my values, with what I really care about. So I call those people explorers. And the other group I love to work with is pioneers. So they're people maybe a little further on the journey who've been exploring, who said, you know what, this is what I stand for, and maybe they've set up something new, maybe they set up some sort of enterprise or project, or maybe they stayed in very conventional roles, but they're showing up very differently and they're really prepared to stick their necks out and lead again based on their real values. So those are the people I love to work with. And that took me first to studying the program that you were on, and then later I was invited to be part of the staff team. And so I was with it quite a long time, 10, 15 years, I think. So then I got to work with... Sorry.
Can you just give a bit of that, of what that, that master was all about? Because there'll be a lot of people who will have no idea what that program was all about, but it's someone that was involved in it fairly early on, and like you travelled with it for quite some time.
I did, yeah.
It'd be just fascinating for people to understand.
Well,
now it's like I'm just like, what, God, at this time we're in now, it feels like a lot of folks wanting to dive into this.
Well, in my cheeky tutor mode, I would say, Dan, why don't you describe what you think it is first, and then I can. I mean, would you? Because it'd be nice, because you were on it, right? So why don't you? Well, could you sum up what you think this program was about from your side?
Oh God, this is I find this like, so I mean, it was this 2 years, which I can't, you say, oh, it was a master's program. It was like, people go, oh, that's interesting, well done and stuff. And you go, no, it was it's sort of like, kind of like, I've sort of never been the same since. And I don't mean that in a bad, well, I mean that in multiple ways, but, it's like, it's like you get it's like a complete unraveling of everything that you thought you knew. And it was an unlearning experience.
That's right.
But then which enabled me, I mean, without a doubt, has played such a big part in the journey I've been on in the last 12 years. I mean, there's no, it's just, I can't describe it enough to people. It was just, and I guess I was, just quickly, I went on that I was starting to ask some big questions. So I kind of knew that I needed something that was going to offer some support to go in deeper into some of these questions that you're talking about. But the different ways of learning and exploring what is knowledge, and that for me was some of the most profound stuff, as well as the content was there, but it's actually
Yeah.
more about the how,
The
really, and
process.
the process.
Yeah. No, I think
And
that's
it's
right.
and this inquiry based way of showing up, which has been I mean that's become central to what I do. So yeah, so yeah, and this fantastic network
Yeah.
of people, which again I'm curious about from your perspective, someone who has sort of
Yeah.
supported so many people through that journey.
Yeah.
You must have experienced so much
Yeah. Well, it was
about
amazing. It's
how
what.
we
Sorry, gone.
go on. No, that's it. I
Well,
shut
no,
up.
you're right. You're right. I mean, it's lovely to hear. So, and the first thing to say was I was on the program as a student first, and then because of my connections with it and my existing skill set, I became staff. So I've done both, and for me, it was just a wonderful experience as well. There is something very special about it, and as you know, you can't always break that down. So I think there was what I would call a lineage. I think there was something about what went into it, and the people who've travelled along the journey, and I'm sure you've had people on the podcast who've been on it. There are some fantastic people doing amazing things and very different things in this whole space who've been through that program or connected with it. It really is an amazing community. And I think you're right. What makes it such a special community is the vast majority of people on that program. So the first thing to say for people who don't know, it was pretty much any age. We didn't take people just from university. They had to have something behind them. So it would be kind of mid to late 20s was youngest, all the way up to 60s. People retired were on the course, and everything in between. And that was deliberate. That was about getting diverse perspectives. It was about people from all over the world. And even though we were conscious, we didn't really want loads of people flying from Australia, we did also think that when they said to us, there is no other program in the world like this, so I'm willing to fly, we kind of said, well, yeah, that's right. So make sure you learn enough to kind of make a real impact back home. So we had people from all over the world, different ages. We had people from every sector. So we had commercial, large multinational, we had startups, we had entrepreneurs, we had public sector, we had teachers, artists, therapists, every different type of person.
Yeah.
And so what did these people have in common? Because the diversity was great. All of them, in some way, were asking themselves, how do I take... This is how I would say it, Dan. I'd be interested if you agree. But the thing I loved, and these are the people I serve, and these are the people I love to work with, absolutely love to work with still, was it doesn't matter what level I'm at, what age I'm at, what sector I'm at, now is the time for me to find some way of connecting what I'm doing in the world with the stuff I really, really care about. And for the people who came on that course, the caring was always in some way to do with the ecological, social justice, ecological justice. It was about transforming the world for the better. And so it was incredibly creative. And I guess a few things that I think created the alchemy, because again, this might be relevant in terms of the times we're in, and it's certainly relevant to the work I'm doing now. And the course was finished. It finished, I think, it's about 3 years ago. One is community. Many, many people, and it started to change as time went on. So it was more at the beginning, but I think all the way through, many people felt very alone with these questions. They felt like I'm the weirdo. Everyone else seems to be thinking everything's fine, and somehow it used to be fine for me now, and it's not, because I'm worried about this stuff. But I feel a bit weird. I feel a bit alienated. I feel a bit ashamed of this stuff, And so it was a place where we could say, actually, two things. One is you're not alone, and that was incredibly powerful. And I think, you'll agree, so much of what people got was that camaraderie of just fellow travellers. And then the second thing was, and we did this in various ways, not only are you not alone, but your experience, which many people start with, of I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling maybe a bit depressed, I'm feeling lost, I'm feeling very worried about the world. It wasn't joyful stuff to start with. You help people reframe it and go, well, great, because this is a step on a journey which not only the world needs, but which millions, and I would say now hundreds of millions of people are on. So not only are you not alone, but this painful experience you might be having as certain things unravel is part of a much bigger story. And so I think that was very powerful for people. We didn't just tell them that. Of course, we'd have speakers in and they'd talk with each other. And then the other thing, which in the end I think people loved, again, they had to unlearn, it's a great phrase that you use, is we said, oh, and by the way, we don't have any answers. We don't know. These questions are so big and so systemic, so interrelated and so complex that anyone who thinks they've got the answer, you'd be suspicious. And you can't even know the answer. So you have to kind of live the answer as a kind of continual creative, conscious kind of research or experiment. That's when you said inquiry. And that takes people some time to get their heads round. And, we did have people come, is sometimes in real distress about the state of the world.
So I just remembered year 2. So what is this inquiry thing?
People, it took 2 years, but that's why it was a 2-year part-time course. But if I strip out the elements, the course is finished, but the elements I think that are still so valuable now is helping people realize you're not alone. It's changing. I mean, things like Extinction Rebellion. I personally think one of the most powerful things about Extinction Rebellion, and there are, for me, positive and negative things about that movement, but it was a sudden sign that, oh my God, there's lots of people who think like this, and that's very powerful for people. So you're not alone. And then to locate what you're going through as part of a bigger story that, yes, it's very personal. It's about you and your life and your choices, but it's also about something totally transpersonal, something beyond you, the spirit of our times or awakening global consciousness. I find I use those sorts of ideas and practices a lot in my own work. I find they're so powerful at helping us move past our, fear or whatever. And then to realize you'll never have the answer anyway. Once people kind of got that, they started to just have a wonderful time, really. But it did take some getting.
and that whole, it's funny. I was talking about this and writing about this a lot at the moment about not knowing. And again, like in these times, in these moments, about this, feels like we're again, sort of this reveal that's occurred through the pandemic, because it feels like it's sort of like lifted. It's almost like, feels like it's done, it's lifted the lid for a huge amount of people that weren't seeing this mess, maybe weren't able to see the suffering and the inequalities and the destruction maybe as clearly as others were. But it's almost like this pandemic has sort of done a big reveal, and then so therefore it's like, as we move into this, you can feel the sort of shouts of the, let's turn the economy back on. Exactly. Let's but it's almost like one of the things I've been really exploring is it actually the not knowing that's the biggest crisis, the fact that we're so scared of not knowing, like of the sort of fear of the fear, really, of sort of thinking, well, if not what it was before, then what? Do you know what I mean? And because we've been sort of trained up through the system to pretend we know, that you can have certainty, and that's sort of, at least in my sense, the sort of illusion of that idea. And so now, if you've been sort of practicing not knowing, then you're able to. It takes time, but you're able then to sort of live with some joy with that as well as the fear of it. Do you know what I mean? And so it's so interesting, and it's just, as you were just talking as well, just making me think about, why that, you talked earlier on about, when you were younger, about being able to, wanting to ask the bigger questions, wanting to explore those questions, and then the feeling like you're on the edges, or you're, the weirdo, or able to bring those questions into, and then obviously through that program, again, the sense of community where you're able to explore that. And it's just interesting, because those are sort of, they feel like just practices, right, that you'd think, well, what would it be like if we're able to ask those bigger questions from a young age and not be afraid or what I mean, or made to feel weird. And what if we did have a community around us that were willing to sort of hold us while we ask those questions? Yeah.
that's the model. It's surely one element of the society we want to be creating.
Mm.
And I'm certain that other human cultures at different places and times in history have been much more centered on that, really.
Mm.
There may have only been pockets at different times, but I'm certain there have been cultures that have had spiritual questions very much more at their heart. Again, I'm not, I've quite involved in a Tibetan Buddhist approach. I'm not overly romantic about it. The Tibetan Buddhist system, by the time the Chinese invaders had many problems, kind of institutional, it become big institutions, there were issues. But fundamentally, that was a culture that was much, much closer to having at the center of the culture questions about, what is it to be awake? What is it to be fully human? And there have been other cultures, and I'm sure many indigenous cultures have had their own versions of that. So I think it's possible. I think it's absolutely possible, and I think it will happen. And I just think one of the questions is just to notice what is at the center of this culture. Right? It's not that; it's something else, and we can talk about what that is. And maybe, this is one of the ideas I use in my work around. It actually comes from the idea of Buddhist mandalas, which are these sort of geometric forms, and what's at the center kind of radiates out and determines the whole world, if you like. In a way, you could say it's a bit like Eastern systems thinking. So the question of what's at the center is actually a very good question to ask, and one could ask it of one's own life. What am I really putting at the center? Not what I say, but if I look at how I spend my time, what's at the center? Because that is kind of creating your world. You could talk about it at this conversation. What are we putting at the center of our conversation? But if you look at what's going on in the world, well, we've put a few ideas, fairly shoddy ideas. Maybe they were useful at a certain point. Maybe one or two of them were useful after the Second World War or after the First World War, or about counting certain things and making certain numbers bigger. And you put a few numbers at the center, and everything else kind of clusters around that. And before you know it, here you go. You've got industrial growth society. And it does what it's intended to do very well. It's just there's a whole load of concerns and questions that just get shoved to the edge. I'm fascinated by the idea of what could a future society or a more integrated society look like. And it would absolutely have that. The school system would be different. You wouldn't be having politicians and policymakers say, well, the purpose of the school system is to create a workforce. They would be saying the purpose of education is to create, integrated, healthy, wise, compassionate human beings. Well, you put that in the center and everything would start to reconfigure. So this is what we need to do, Dan.
I know. I mean, it's so. Oh God, I love the words.
Let's make it so.
I know, but it's so interesting. I was listening to, I can't remember what it was. Very smart Israeli man, Yuval
Hurry.
Sapiens. Yes,
Yeah.
and being interviewed last week, and he was just saying again, what he was just getting to is like, what's the purpose? He says, let's stop talking about economies, but what is it? What's it? What is it? What's the purpose of it all?
Yeah.
Where are we going? What matters?
Yeah.
And until I think, like you say, until we have that at the moment, like the narratives, it's just let's get the economy going again. Let's crank up the engines. Let's get back to work. And it's like, for what? And then I guess it's coming on to, and everyone says money, well, we all need money, and I know that this is a really big part of your work, and it's something which, what it feels, at least in my inquiring into all of this, a lot of the sort of, some of the sort of gifting, generosity stuff that I've been exploring with, with Good for Nothing for the last 10 years. But,
Yeah.
but we're always, whatever we get to right now. It's like most people's problems, you speak to anyone, within one or two questions, we hit money. You know what I mean? Or we hit
Totally.
this has happened and I can't do this because of that. And then suddenly it's money. And then everything, we're in this paradigm of money, where everything seems to have been monetized. And so on one hand, it's almost impossible for people to see that there can be any other way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as I know, what you've been exploring, there's obviously a lot more going on, right, around this idea. And I'd love to sort of get into the money thing, right? But I wonder just, because just like, and it's reminding me a bit of, and in fact, it was you that introduced this into at least my experience of when I was going through the master program with Peter Coney, and that money workshop, which sort of like blew everyone's minds. So I don't know. Just can we talk about money?
Yeah,
it feels quite important.
Definitely, let's talk about money. I think you actually described it really well. That it kind of arrives if you're paying attention, and you start to ask these questions about, how would we want society to be, or what would I really like at the centre of my life, or, what would be the creative leap I could imagine, in some area. If you pay attention, very often the reason somehow we don't do it, or we feel we can't do it, or we postpone it, we delay it, we filter it, we dumb it. The reason somehow so many of us, and I include myself, have a feeling we can't just fully follow this flow of, I would say, the flow of life. When you look, it's often to do with money. And so this is very, very interesting. And so I do think, having been a politician, you mentioned that I was for a while an elected politician, and I've been an activist, and I've been an educator. And I've come to think that helping people and groups go deep with an awareness of money and how it tangles up their life energy is one of the most radical political things that I've ever done. I'm not saying it's the only way. I mean, I absolutely believe you always need all sorts of approaches. But I do think that to the extent that this thing about money isn't in the conversation of activists or people who want to change the world, something very, very powerful and highly charged is just missing from the conversation. So how I got into it, well, on the master's program that we're talking about, there was the second week was looking at new economics. And why was it the second week looking at new economics? Well, the first week was, hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the course. Here's the state of the planet. And people left sort of, they'd had a wonderful week meeting kindred spirits who were all now as totally depressed as each other. It wasn't quite that bad. But, it's not good when you spend a week really considering the state of the planet ecologically, in terms of social justice and development. It's not pretty.
Oh yeah, if you're not in fear, then you're not listening.
Well, something like that for sure. Stephen Harding at Schumacher College, I'm sure you heard him say this, he used to present the state of the planet and say to people, and if you're not depressed at this point, you need to see a psychiatrist. And actually we're joking, but it's important because as one stage, and it's not the stage to stay at, and it's not the only stage, and it's certainly not the only truth, right? But as one stage, if we avoid fear and sadness and grief at what's going on, it's actually hard to find your position to take some action. So as long as that's not the whole truth, but I think we do need to engage with that stuff for sure. And anyway,
it's an acceptance, isn't it? It's like an acceptance of it in order to be able to sort of, move through it.
Yeah, maybe it's always. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about that as well, right? I think if you're part of the world, sad things happen in the world, you're going to feel sadness, right? It's not the whole of it, but that's just going to be part of it. Anyway, week two, the question was, well, why are we doing this? Why is it we've set up amazing systems that are creating this stuff? And the answer was something to do with, well, what are we chasing? What's at the center? It's kind of numbers, and numbers are wrapped up in money. It's economic growth. So we used to have this wonderful week of trying to understand what was driving ideas of economic growth and what alternative ideas were out there about doing money differently, different ways of measuring success, different ways of measuring GDP, etc. We had some wonderful people in. But it was only when I found the work of this guy, Peter Koenig. He's the only person I've met who says, yeah, well, that's all very well, we need that stuff, but if we don't understand, this is my terminology now, but how the money system is inside us. You know, Foucault would say it's like about a biopower. It's like it's in us, these different pulls and tensions and the way we police ourselves. And if we don't understand, Peter would say, the unconscious kind of material around money that does impede our life energy, then even if we have the best idea in the world about transforming the finance system, sooner or later, humans will find a way to turn that brilliant idea into another kind of unfair, unkind system, because we're acting out of consciousness when it comes to money. That's the basic idea. So I trained with him. He's a remarkable guy, still going strong. He's now worked with tens of thousands of people on this work, and I've been running his work for, on and off actually, for sort of 10, 15 years, and I'm doing increasing amounts of it. And what the money work does is, it helps you really investigate what is your story of money, because one of the things we say is money is a great taboo. As you say, most people will talk about money very quickly, and they'll talk about it as if it's just kind of self-evident, or I wish I could do that, but I can't because I haven't got the money, or yeah, of course I'd love to do this, but who's going to pay the bills? And we say these things, or we think these things all the time, but we never really go further and look at what's going on there. What are the emotions? What are the beliefs? What is it that I'm convinced is true about the world? And what's kind of sitting underneath it? So that's kind of what we do with the money work. And we sort of have two stages of the money work. One is just increasing awareness. So people get very interested in, where did my stories come from? We look at people's family history. We look at current patterns. We play games with money. All different ways of being a detective and starting to inquire. I thought this was normal, but now I realize this is my money pattern. And then we go deeper and we find what kind of unconscious beliefs, you might say, are holding that in place. And then you can actually free them up. So the aim of the money work, and it's really important to be clear, the money work is not to get more money.
Yeah.
And I always say that. And that's why there's probably many more courses that will sell much more easily. Because if you say, come on this workshop and you'll get loads of money.
Yeah.
But the point is, the money workshop is in service of life. The money workshop is work out your money kind of awareness, so that whether you have more money or less money or the same money or whatever's going on around money, you will feel more and more free and able to follow the flow of life. And for me, that is very political as well. It's lovely work for people. It supports their growth and development. But again, coming back to the bigger picture, it's exactly what you said. I think now we're living at a time where possibly the majority of people, if you look at sort of demographic evidence and world value studies, I think we're at a phase where, certainly in countries like the UK, possibly a majority or certainly a sizable minority absolutely would argue we need a profound shift. We need a shift in the way everything works, work works, and more people are up for it, but then money, and it taps into insecurity, fear, a whole load of stuff. Well, if you can free people up to realize that a lot of that stuff is more of an unconscious story that we're just holding on to and is not actually about how life itself works. And by the way, not only is it not how life works, but there is this huge moment and movement going on with people starting to free themselves up. You can tell I get excited about it. I think it is one of the keys for people kind of taking individual action, which then becomes collective action. And, possibly things like pandemic might support that, but they might not. That's the thing. It might create more insecurity, or it might create more possibility. And we don't know. The question is, well, what would one do to try and maximize the chance that it creates more freedom? What would you do?
It's so interesting that, isn't it, and bringing it into this time, because my sense of yeah, obviously there's some people obviously immediately, the economics of it and the very real
Yeah,
situation of money not drying up or not being there. Of course, that can lead you into huge distress
of
and
course. Yeah,
suffering. But
yeah.
on the flip side, there's this other thing that's going on for some people, but myself included, actually, just the reality of like,
Mm.
well, there's also like sort of figuring out how much you can do,
Hmm.
how much more you can do than you thought you could do.
Hmm.
So your sort of dependence on things and
Hmm.
behaviors and things that you do and things you pay money for, which you realize you just don't need to be doing. You can actually cope with a lot of that. The money you just like working. I was just looking at like what I've saved on travel the
Yeah,
last couple of
yeah.
months. I've just gone, that's insane. And I'm a very, I'm a quite a distributed worker. I work for myself. I don't always go into a place, but I'm still spending a lot of money on trains and a lot of money
Well,
like
trains are very expensive in this country as
coffees
well.
and coffees and sandwiches and all
No,
these
I don't.
things that
No,
you
I know what you
and you
mean.
start
Yeah.
going, this is nuts. And then you go, but then the story is, well, that supports the economy. You're like, hold on a minute, what is going on here? And I'd love to know more about, are there things that you like, the types of breakthroughs that you
Mm,
see people having in this?
mm.
Or can you talk a
Yeah,
bit
no,
about
I
that? Or
can. I mean, I can share some. It's not particularly plugging it, but it is very experiential. So I can share stories, and there is something about the visceral experience that's key. Before I do that, and I will do that, I also wanted to say
mm,
something about the pandemic thing,
mm,
because I think what's starting to happen, a lot of the shifts are at the semi-conscious level. What do I mean? That, yeah, people are, many people are struggling and insecure and worried, and, that's important. At the level of what Arnie Mindell, who's a psychologist who I'm totally into at the moment and training in his
mm,
approach, it's like you have to pay attention to what he calls consensus reality, right? If the
mm,
numbers are down, if that there's not food on the table, this is very real and needs to be addressed and acknowledged and respected.
mm,
And there's always a deeper level, which he calls the dreaming, where there's other things moving as well. And in his work, in fact, he also talks about a third, the essence level. But the idea, and this is why I like it as an approach for working with people and society, you have to acknowledge and respect all levels. So if we said this is only about how do we recover from a 14% economic growth, a decrease in GDP or whatever, if we only fixate on numbers or how many
mm,
pieces of protective equipment do we have, we're just talking about consensus reality. We're not paying attention to some of the more subtle movements. But
mm,
also, if we only pay attention to subtle movements, well, that's very privileged, because there are people with real, who don't have protective equipment or don't have food on the table. But if you can relate the two, then I think you get more of a sense of what's possible. So that the reason I say that is because I think some of what's going on for everybody is, whose work is important? It's interesting that most of the people who are key workers, most of them are not well paid. They are the van drivers, the shop assistants, the nurses, the care home people. Whereas the mega rich bankers, I mean, they are carrying on working. But society, I think, is starting to realise what is really important. What do we
yeah.
really? So I think that's an important shift.
It's fascinating. I just wrote about this last week. I wrote a very long, rambling sort of bunch of reflections on
Yeah,
Medium about what this stuff was throwing up,
yeah,
and even just obviously through talking to peers and networks, just and through all these WhatsApp groups that you end up being in, and you just think, I've definitely sensed there's a lot of people there's lots of people, inverted commas, doing professional things who've had a lot. I would regard anyone that's been able to anyone who's been able to be locked down at home for the last few weeks as as privileged, right? And
mm,
myself included. Like
mm,
if you're not, if you haven't had to really go out,
mm,
you've effectively bought. I know it's been a struggle and all things, but ultimately, a huge amount of people haven't had any of that. They've been out keeping the country, functioning, and yeah. So this idea of like this time, probably the reveal of like what is it that we are all doing
mm,
with this time, with our
mm,
sort of busyness, and like you say, what we financially value in terms of what people do, and what we see as, as more rewarding of money and, esteem and all these other things. I mean, it's fascinating, all this stuff that's being shaken up. So I to what you're just saying, how this stuff gets surfaced, and you know what I mean, and actually kind
Yeah.
of recognized, this feels like the big thing, because again, the urge is just to get the machine going fast.
Yeah, and that is very
Yeah,
strong, and it is probably what will happen on the consensus reality, on the practical level. But other things are afoot
after
and stir.
picnics and
Yeah.
rambles and stuff. Really.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, who can say? I couldn't say what's happening, but there's lots of shifts and stuff. I mean, one of the things I think, because you asked about examples about the workshop, I think
Yes.
one of the most powerful things in the workshop, and again, I just want to emphasize that by saying it, hopefully that's interesting and helpful for people, but it is something that people can have a visceral, an embodied experience of, and that's where the juice is. So the most interesting thing for me about the money workshop is it ends up being kind of body work or energy work, which people wouldn't expect. And it makes sense to me more and more. I mean, this is the thing actually this is the edge of what I'm researching at the moment. We use words in the money workshop, and we talk about different kind of views of how things might work, a kind of an industrial view or an ecological view, or many of the sorts of ideas you'll have read in people like Charles Eisenstein. But the shift happens at what I could only call a body or an energetic level, and that to me is totally fascinating. And so I think I describe this in different ways, but one way to think about it is our money story is a conceptual story. Money is a human creation. It hasn't always been around. Life existed for billions of years before there was money, right? So money is a construction, it's a human creation, we made it, and it only keeps behaving itself or behaving in any sort of, predictable way because we keep believing in it in the same way. We share a set of ideas and assumptions more or less about money. Now that's very, very powerful, so when a number goes down on a graph, maybe millions of people go, and maybe then because we all go, we do certain things and it creates problems in the world. But the point is that ultimately, money and everything around it is a human conceptual construction. Or let's at least suggest that. There may be more to it than that. Whereas life, although we might talk about life, or we might have theories about life, but life exists without humans to kind of think about it, right? In other words, there is an underlying, what could you say, pattern of organization, flow, of life. And so fundamentally, what I think the workshop does is it helps people to decouple money and life. And again, if you remember the story I said right at the beginning, so often we say, well, I'd love to do this, brackets, in my life, or in my life purpose, or my soul, or my vocation. There's some tug or pull of flow that the deeper part of us wishes to follow. And I would say that is the intelligence of life that's not just a human construction. It's not just a story. There's something much vaster and deeper going on there. And then we go, oh yeah, but I can't because of money. So I think in us, we play this often a tension, and I'd like to say a dance, but I think for most of us it's more of a battle between the money story and the life path, if you like. I hope this makes sense so far.
Yeah.
And so, but the problem is because it's not conscious, we just think this is how it is. And we somehow give money the same gravitas or the same sense of reality and weight as life. But if you just look at the history of humanity, the history of the planet, if you look at your own life, you came into life with no money, Dan. You did. And you might say, well, my parents had money, but not everyone's parents. Life is created, life happens, and life moves and evolves and flows. And actually, when you look, it's very, very much less to do with this thing that we created that we call money than we imagine. And so part of it is to help people sort of decouple those things. That's the first step. And again, I think in terms of what's going on in the world at the moment, who are the people that we're valuing? It's not about the people paid, it's the ones who are preserving life, creating food, creating connection, who are, I would say, who are somehow supporting vitality and life. And other people who may be on megabucks, but whose work does not necessarily support life, we're suddenly realizing, well, they're not so vital. And I'm not knocking, it's not about rich or poor, or all sorts of professions are useful, but there is a decoupling. And what that tells us is, one of the stories in our culture, which is totally absurd, but is in most of us, is many people believe, even alternative people, even people who are trying to, do things differently, deep in us somewhere is, actually, if I'm successful or important, I would have money. And if I don't have money, somehow this diminishes me. And that might be because we connect money to ideas of worth or value or success or being powerful, or, a whole load of stuff, right? And that's partly personal, and that may come in our personal process, maybe in our history, but it's also mirrored around us all the time. The point is, as long as we believe that that's true, it will be much... Let's say, for example, I have in me a very common unconscious belief that money represents success and my worth, right? It's very common. If I'm not conscious of that, it's very likely to lead me into choices where, let's say, I stay with a job that doesn't satisfy my soul, that isn't the direction that my life wants to flow. I mean, if I'm lucky, then maybe it is, but for many people it's not. But I do it because it gives me money, because although I say, well, of course I need money, but deep down, unconsciously, I believe if I let go of money, I have no worth and I'm a failure. Simultaneously, if I share that same unconscious projection and I'm not aware of it, I might sit thinking, wow, what I really want to do is this. I want to set up this project, or I want to just grow more vegetables, or it could be anything, it could be big or small, but my life is flowing in a direction. But let's say, because of how consensus reality works right now, and because of the agreements we've made more or less right now, to choose to go from being a banker to a, I don't know what, shiatsu therapist, let's say, well, my money flow would diminish. Well, life might want me to do that right now. That might be my place to serve. But if I believe that with less money, I have less worth and I'm a failure, it would be hard for me to take that step. So I guess behind the work is helping people, first of all, to decouple. Money is not life. It really isn't. Secondly, and this comes back to, what do you choose to place at the center of your life? Or what will we choose to place at the center collectively of our society? If we choose to put a number, a money number at the center, then that will create a set of mass behaviors. And we will try and maximize the money number, but we will be diminishing life. We might say vitality, health, soul, ecology. If we realize that money is kind of a story and at best needs to serve life, we might say, what really is a life-giving set of principles to put at the center? How would you like to create a life for a society? And you might say, well, I don't know, health or beauty or wisdom, or, could be different things. And then you realize that if you step in that direction, you might have more money, it's possible. You might have the same money, you might have less. But none of that actually makes you, less powerful or less successful. That's just kind of nonsense. And so the money work is about helping people do that work and experience at quite a deep level how they might do that. And the reason I say it's body work is it's more and more my belief that we have a natural intelligence, which I would say is about following life. People have different words, so you might say life or flow or innate wisdom. I don't mind the language.
Yeah.
But we have it, and it is more in our bodies. And then we have ideas and stories about how things should be or how they work, and that's more. I'm being simplistic, but that's more of the head. Of and it always interests me that when we talk about capitalism, and when business people talk about capital, they usually kind of mean money. And that comes from the word capita, meaning the head. So there's something about money that exists much more as a thought. And there's nothing wrong with money, there's nothing bad about money. But if we're just following unconscious thoughts about money, we ignore kind of this much vaster intelligence. So, yeah, I've gone off on one there a bit, Dan, but I hope that gives a flavour of it.
Yeah. No,
you can tell I love the work. I love it.
No, I do. It's fascinating. I mean, I've been doing a project in the last few months, end of last year, with two networks for economic transition, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Green Economy Coalition, which is, effectively they're working towards, economies that are sort of grounded in, ecological limits and human well-being,
right.
As sort of,
yeah.
And there's this, working with this phrase, an economy in service to life,
right.
to all life.
Yeah.
And figuring out how do you how do you shift the stories that we hold true about economies and our belief systems, which again ultimately they're just a series of beliefs that were constructed. And so and obviously the money piece is a huge one. It's when we think of economy, most people think of money. That's what it's become. But actually, that's just an idea.
Well, exactly. But it's such a powerful. It's so powerful.
Yeah, and it's making me think right now. Then with again in this moment with these reveals that are going on, which you've talked to specifically in this situation, as so much has been revealed about those who are keeping our society alive, whether it's through healthcare or food or transportation or whatever it might be, right? All these extraordinary people that in today's monetary terms are probably have the worst deal. And then obviously, there will be a lot of people who have had huge time to reflect over these weeks, who in monetary terms have been doing very well. And questioning obviously the value, I guess, of all this massive disparity, but maybe also, at least I'm sensing, lots of people are questioning some of these questions that you explore through your money work. What is it? Why am I committed to the money piece? What is it that I'm doing? I've lost touch with who I am, my life, my family, my my community, the planet. All of these things that have been sacrificed. Or maybe not even ever noticed in some cases, because of this drive, this sort of link between money and identity and self-worth, or I don't know.
Well, it could be many things. I mean, what we say in the money work is that you can tangle almost anything, any human quality up with money, right? So I was giving a simple example. So I'm not saying it's the same for everybody. This is what makes the work so lovely.
Yes.
So for you, I don't know, you may unconsciously very much associate money with success, and that will tangle you up in certain ways. Someone else, it might be much more about money represents freedom, right? Someone else, it might be negative. I mean, I'm very fascinated. We haven't really got onto shadow stuff particularly, but I work a lot with people who are changing the world, who are, well, I don't want to say it that way, who are pioneers, who are trying to pioneer new approaches. Now, often they have money and resource issues, and when you dig a little bit, you realize they think money is horrible or dirty, or people who have money are greedy bastards. But that's equally an unhelpful, unconscious idea. Because if unconsciously I think I'm one of the righteous and people who have money are dirty, greedy bastards and they're the problem, which, by the way, a lot of activists I work with do have that sort of idea, then what will I do when it comes to money? If it's unconscious, I don't want to be around money. I don't really want to have money come to me. And I will find it very hard to take choices in service of my life or my project that might actually bring money. And I'm convinced this is why so many very well-meaning groups are chronically under-resourced. It's not that they're fleet of foot and funky. I mean, I know Good for Nothing, for example, is very different because you had a different model. But many kind of charities and alternative groups are actually more fixated on money than some big businesses, because they're so, in some way, so unconsciously against money. So again, I'm simplifying a bit, but the point is we could have negative or positive unconscious associations with money, and either of those will drive different behaviours. The more we become conscious of it, and as you speak, I think you're right. People are questioning now, but what I love about the money work, I think there is like a bit of a missing piece or an extra piece in the puzzle, because if we go back to where we started, many of us do have kind of visions of a different world or a different way of being, and we take steps in that direction, but often we're pulled back, and the stuff that pulls us back seems very familiar. Do you know what I mean? It feels like, oh yeah, it's this again, or the world is this way. And I think the possibility of at that point being really interested, you go, here I am again, I haven't quite made the step, or whatever it is, be really interested. So what is my belief here about money or lack of money or this step? And can I play with it and disentangle it a little bit? I don't know if that makes sense, Dan, but I hope it does.
It does, and if for folks that are interested, I mean, you have sort of various forms of this work that you offer out, right?
Yeah. So I mean, most usually I do it in a 2-day workshop, and I still think that's the best way to be introduced to it, because there is so much learning when you hear other people share their money stories. Because one of the things is we all think what we do with money is normal. And that's what makes it a taboo. We don't realise that you've got your quirky way of doing money. You've got the things you do, the things you don't. It's like your little kinks, your money kinks. And we all got them, and we all just think that's normal. And when you're in a group of people, and it's a beautiful space, it's very safe, it's very funny, but you learn so much from hearing other people's stories. I mean, I could give one quick example if that's helpful, or if we have time.
Yeah.
I've written this up on my website because it's such a nice story. You get such unique stories, and we have had every sort of person comes on the workshop. But one story that really struck me was at a workshop. It was people take time to kind of do deep dives when they're ready. And one woman spoke up, and she actually spoke very, very powerfully. She had a very strong voice, a very strong presence. She was very powerful, which was funny. And in her story, we explore, current situation and history. And effectively, this woman had been in a reasonably well-paid job and had followed more her heart to do a kind of an art type project, and had very little money coming into her life. And she felt this really was diminishing her. And she felt powerless. This was her word, right? She felt powerless because she had no money. She felt really kind of smaller, diminished, and powerless. And of course, the kind of irony was the way she spoke was incredibly powerful. She had such presence. But in her belief system, money equals power. She had no money. She felt she had no power. So that's the detective work. The next step, the kind of integration work, is we have to help her see, and I won't get into exactly how we do this, but it is a kind of embodied experience, that her power is nothing to do with a number. Just like that's true for everybody. It can't be. Our human power, agency, creativity, but for her power, it makes no sense that it's connected to a number. So she really got that. And you can see, she looked, people changed, their faces changed, they relaxed. She looked amazing. And I thought, well, that, lovely, that's great. Who's next? And then a woman a little bit next to her, like a few seats down, spoke up in a very, very quiet voice. And we could hardly hear what she was saying. And she said something like, I paraphrase, she said something like, I own 6 houses and half a yacht. And I said, sorry, I don't think I didn't quite hear. And then she kind of got stronger. As she spoke, she got stronger. And basically she shared her story because she'd resonated with this other woman. And they were polar opposites in their financial situations. The woman who spoke second, she had a very well-paid job. She was actually working in some area of kind of finance. She was very competent, well-paid. She had been very clever with her investments. So she and her husband had a property business that they were running that was bringing in, as I recall, a 6-figure rental income. They didn't really need to work. Certainly she didn't need to work full time. But what she said is, I realise that although I've got all of this, I too feel powerless. And she'd realised it because of the generosity and the power of the first woman. And the first woman, money was power. She didn't have it, so she felt powerless. The second woman was money was power, and she didn't experience herself as powerful. And we went into reasons why and things from her past. So her way of trying to deal with that was to, through her whole life, and she suddenly saw it, make choice after choice to maximize money, because she believed with money I will find power, I will feel powerful. But feeling powerful is an embodied human experience. It's nothing to do with a number. And so she'd just seen this, and she'd realized that all of this accumulation, and it was good in many ways. She'd been very successful. It had not in any way given her what she was really looking for. So again, we did the same piece of work with a woman in a completely different financial. So again, the consensus reality, the numbers, the property, completely different. At the deeper level, both of them, for whatever reason, and we're all like this in different degrees with different things, they were not fully in touch with their intrinsic human power. And because that's a difficult and painful place to be, they'd projected the idea of that power onto money. So if I had money, or when I have money, then I will reclaim my power. I will feel powerful. But that never happens, because we're always then chasing something out there. So both of them then left that workshop being more powerful, whether they had money or not. Now, the funny thing is, the first woman, emailed me, I think it was just like 3 weeks later, said she'd just been offered a job for more money than she'd ever had before. Now, money isn't the point. So that may, to be honest, I don't care about the money. I care, is that serving your life? So I'm not saying it was, but it was interesting. And the second woman started to do what she'd always wanted to do. She bought a camper van. She started to get much more into yoga. She was still working, but I think she went 3 days, 4 days. So, the actual outer changes are relatively small initially for most people. But both of those women, I hope, go out into the world feeling that they are powerful, and losing the kind of bullshit idea that their power and their possibility of expressing power in the world is anything to do with a number. And I think that's the political thing, right? That's the political thing. Because if you look at disadvantaged communities, if you look at people losing jobs, again, on consensus reality, this is important stuff. We need to take care of people. But fundamentally, does it make you less powerful, less creative, less free? Not at the deepest level, not at the level of who we really are. And I think if enough of us, or many of us, regardless of the numbers we have in our life, if enough of us could start to really get that sense of, oh, wow, I am actually free, powerful, creative. Oh, and by the way, we're all human. We're constrained and also lack power. You have to have both of these in your life, right? It's not one-sided. But I think there's something very exciting that could happen as one piece of this thing that your podcast is exploring. And you can probably tell whenever I talk about it, I just get really excited, because it's lovely. It's lovely to be part of it. It really is.
It's lovely to hear and to listen, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And thank you to the two ladies. I mean, I always say to people, I don't share anything that could ever be attributed, but they were both incredibly generous. And that's the other thing you see about this work is anytime someone steps across into that taboo of saying, here's how it is for me, it always feels a bit edgy, but it's incredibly generous, because they're always helping the people in the group. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've got a time thing, but it does just, it sort of almost goes back to where we started from, about, community ability to sort of inquire more deeply, to show our vulnerabilities and our questions, and
and that we're not alone.
Right,
we're not alone,
right.
and that the things that we maybe at a certain point think, well, I'm just weird and slightly ashamed, often can be tremendous gifts and part of a much bigger story, much bigger. This is
Yeah.
the thing I'm really,
So how can people find you, your work? What's coming up? Anything you want to share?
Well, the best probably thing is my website, which is
Yeah.
www.differentspace.co.uk. It's all one word,
I'll stick that in the show notes.
And they can link in with me as well. And I have a newsletter and stuff. I mean, I'm actually running an online money workshop, but I don't know if your podcast will be out. It's May 21st. So I'll give you a deadline, Dan. That's an experiment. I was just invited by, again, someone who's a friend and kind of partner who thought it'd be really interesting to try again in the time of pandemic. So we're calling it Money at a Time of Pandemic. And we will be looking at everything you and I have just been talking about.
Brilliant.
And then I normally have various workshops that I run. And also the other thing we didn't mention is I do the work one-to-one with people or by invitation into groups and stuff. So sometimes people say, well, we really need to look at this as a team, or I'd love to run one in wherever I'm living. So I'm very open to that as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Tim.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been so nice to talk to you. And I feel I've got on my list like about 30 other things I'd love to talk with you again sometime. So
We'll do that. I often ask this question at the end. Well, I'm sort of interested, in the sort of concept of the spaceship Earth. I'm quite intrigued by this idea of sort of becoming crew
on the spaceship Earth.
Yeah, what does that mean? Becoming crew? Does it mean anything to you at this moment? Like, what would that?
Well, if I would say I love the spaceship Earth, so to be crew, what I would say, what comes for me very strongly is, so to be crew on spaceship Earth, there really, really is a role for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's going to tell you your role. It's not like there's the captain who says, this is what you are. But there is a role for everybody. And something that's come to me strongly in this conversation is it's possible, know that you have a role and you're part of something big, and consider that the thing that you think is weirdest about you, or that in some way you feel a bit ashamed about or awkward about, may be the seeds, we were talking about seeds, may have the seeds of what your most beautiful role as a crew member are going to be. And the more you try and fit in with what you think the story of the crew needs, that's probably not going to be it. So maybe I'm saying this to myself more than to anybody. Delight in your weirdness and trust the things you're ashamed of. And then you're a beautiful member of the crew of Spaceship Earth. So I'd love to be part of the crew with you, Dan.
I love that. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, dial up your weirdness and dance with it openly.
Yeah. Well, it transforms. You see, weirdness is just a word. Weirdness is a label, right? And it's a slightly pejorative. It's slightly pejorative. Yeah. So if we take away the word and the judgment, actually we're talking about your absolute uniqueness. We're talking about your particular take and resonance with the world, which is totally unique. We're talking about your sensitivity, the way you just tune into things or how you think about things or whatever it is. So if we strip away the word, then we're thinking, that's it. And it is going to need all of us to offer that on the spaceship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
It's been lovely. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, really
so nice.
Lovely. You take care, and we'll be in touch.
Let me know what's needed next, and I'd love to do another of these, but even if we don't, it's just so nice to talk with you. So let's.
Yeah, we'll definitely post when we can start moving around again.
Yeah.
I shall head on over to Bristol.
Beautiful. All right.
Yeah. All right, Tim.
Thanks, Dan. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Tim Malnick. So beautiful the way Tim sees and senses and thinks. And yeah, really, really enjoyed that conversation. So I hope you did too. Check out his work in the links below. Do share this podcast if you're liking what you hear. Please share with others. Give us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Acast or whatever you listen on. It all helps other people find the podcast. So much appreciated. If you want to get in touch, please do. Dan at thespaceship.earth, or you can get me on Instagram. Started up a new Spaceship Earth channel there now, so that is the spaceship.earth on Instagram. Love to hear from you, and anything you want to shout about or whatever, please get in touch. So until next time, take good care of yourself, look after those around you. Until next time, peace and out.